Agencies use OTAs, or Other Transaction Authority contracts, for $12.5 billion in pandemic spending. The Departments of Defense, Health and Human Services, and Homeland Security use OTAs to stay flexible and respond quickly. But what about transparency and accountability? Jason Knudson is Vice President of Product Development at Second Front Systems. He's former Chief of Staff to the Chief of Naval Operations Rapid Innovation Cell. He's writing about OTAs with co-authors Stan Soloway and Vincent Warbell for IBM. Jason, welcome.
Thanks, Mimi. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
When we say that OTAs are non-traditional contracting methods, what are we talking about? How non-traditional are they?
Right, so the traditional method we're referring to is the federal acquisition requirements. And OTAs came out around 1958 under NASA in response to the launch of Sputnik to try to get after the space race. And we're a core part of NASA achieving dominance in the space race over the former USSR. So these other transactions were extended in the early 90s to DARPA and all the way into 2015 and later were expanded in their authority to move into production and other types of activities, including having a preference for S&T and prototype programs. So they are a separate but equal authority for the federal acquisition requirements under U.S. code.
But how different are they from the regular acquisition method?
So the primary difference is that the federal acquisition requirements are a series of around 3,000 pages of regulations, and the OTAs are just a couple paragraphs in a statute. So they're very lightweight. They offer a lot of flexibility, and the biggest difference is they do require a little bit additional knowledge on how to execute them as they are closer to a commercial contract than a federal contract.
So then, Jason, if OTAs are faster and simpler, why don't we just use them for all federal contracting?
Well, that's a good answer. That's a good question. Primarily is the authorities for especially Department of Defense are restricted currently by law to prototypes and then the follow-on authority to production for a successful prototype. OTAs aren't perfect for everything. The federal acquisition requirements are much better at procuring things like supplies or procuring large groups of tanks or aircraft or ships. OTAs really excel when dealing with non-traditional companies and in the research, development, and prototyping realm.
But then how do you ensure the principles of good contracting, namely competition, accountability, transparency? Do you still get that with an OTA?
You absolutely do. So that was the primary question that we looked at in our brief paper, was not should we use FAR over OTAs, but do OTAs meet the basic tenets of public procurement? So we looked at competition, transparency and accountability, intellectual property rights, disputes and protests, and socioeconomic preferences and diversity. And we did interviews with dozens of senior acquisition professionals. We looked over a subset of OTAs, and we found that competition was met, transparent accountability was met, all the other basic tenets of public procurement were met, but not in the same way that a FAR contract might meet them. A lot of times you meet them in a way that a commercial contract would meet them. But at the end of the day, the basic tenets of public procurements were met both in FAR contracts and in OTAs.
So tell me about how OTAs were used for COVID-19 and the rollout of the vaccine.
Right, so the story of COVID-19 and Operation Warp Speed started back in the 1990s and before the actual COVID-19 vaccine, where some of the initial research on mRNA vaccines was sponsored through DARPA via OTAs. When COVID-19 hit, the National Institute for Health partnered with Department of Defense and several other agencies to stand up Operation Warp Speed. And they used other transaction authorities, heavily leveraging Army Contracting Command's experience with OTAs to do the prototyping across multiple research and development companies.
So what are your recommendations then, Jason, for agencies to use OTAs effectively across the board? What do they need to do to really take advantage of this contracting method?
Well, primarily, we need to understand that federal acquisition requirements and OTAs are separate and distinct authorities under the federal laws. And so it's not sufficient to go and say that because you have experience in a FAR contracts, that you'll have experience in OTAs. We need to remove this grounding bias that we must first understand FAR in order to do OTAs. And by doing that, we are able to access a larger workforce. We're able to train that workforce in commercial contracts, commercial IP rights, and really access the true flexibility of OTAs. I don't think that federal acquisition requirements is ever going to go away, but in order for us to tap into the true power of OTAs, like we did in the space race and with COVID-19, we need to find creative uses of this flexible authority, train up a workforce that includes your contracting officers, your lawyers, your program managers, and your senior leaders, that this is a co-equal option with the federal acquisition requirements, and creatively experiment with the authority and the methodologies to ensure that the basic tenets of public procurement remain in place and that we're able to execute with this authority to achieve national objectives.
All right. Thank you very much, Jason, for being on the program.
Thank you for having me.